Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode 100 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is Barry Meier. Barry is a veteran reporter who has written for the New York Times and received the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, along with other members of the New York Times staff. He's also the first journalist to bring significant attention to the dangers of abuse of the prescription drug OxyContin with his book Painkiller, which was first published in 2003. I invited Barry onto the podcast today to discuss his second book, published in 2016, titled Missing Man: The American Spy Who Vanished in Iran. It's the story of a former FBI agent turned private investigator named Robert Levinson, who went missing in 2007 while on an assignment on Kish Island in the Persian Gulf, and the years-long ordeal his family went through as they sought answers from both the American and Iranian governments. But before we dive into this story, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Erica S. and Eddie A. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Barry, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Of course, Justin. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. I've been wanting to cover this story here on the podcast for well over a year now, and I'm glad my listeners will finally be able to hear it from you, because I don't think very many people out there know it better than you do at this point.
Well, it's a fascinating story, Justin, and it's one that I had to wait many, many years to tell because of the relationship that Bob Levinson, the subject of the book, had with the CIA that we had to essentially keep secret because we didn't want to jeopardize his safety.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So on that note, how long were you waiting exactly, or when did you decide that you wanted to write about this in book form?
Well, just to sort of set the scene for your readers, they may be aware that in 2000, in the early 2010s, I believe it was 2013 or 14, a videotape was released showing an American named Bob Levinson being held hostage. It wasn't clear where he was being held hostage, but it came out fairly soon that he was being held in Iran. And much earlier than that, in 2007, I was contacted by some friends of Bob Levinson who told me that he, in fact, had disappeared while on a visit to Kish Island, which is an island not far from Dubai that is controlled by Iran, and that he, in fact, was a consultant to the CIA at the time of his disappearance. I was shown documents that verified that he had a relationship with the CIA. And for many, many years, we decided at the New York Times not to disclose that connection because of our fears that were he alive, it would in fact jeopardize his life.
Yeah, certainly. That seems like the very sensible move on the part of you and your editors and everyone else involved. So I'm very glad that that happened. So would you say that this was a tough story to research and tell, or was it more of a waiting game in terms of waiting for the information about the CIA connection to finally make its way into light?
Well, it was both. I mean, it was both a fascinating and painful story to research. I mean, I learned a lot about Bob Levinson, his life, his work both as a private investigator, as an FBI agent, and then finally as someone who was working as a contractor for a particular office in the CIA's analytical division. Painful because throughout all of that, I got to know his family and understand the extraordinarily difficult and painful situation they were going through, not knowing what had happened to him and not knowing and feeling that the United States government had let both him down and in turn them down. But, we were confronted with a situation which I had never encountered in my career as a reporter before, which was simply, when does the safety of the subject of an article or of a situation outweigh the benefits of disclosing what we knew about that individual? And I think it was very clear in Bob's case that the dangers that he faced were far more immediate and important than a news story.
Yeah, that has to be a tough call as a reporter because your job is not to quell stories; it's to publicize them. Of course, I mean by its very nature. So I know that was a difficult decision, but it does seem like the right decision. And it's such a tough story to me because, as your book makes very clear, it's not really just the story of Bob, but it's the story of his family and everything that they went through. Like everyone in this book suffers terribly. What was my takeaway from all of it? Bob certainly, physically, but the family emotionally and mentally and spiritually and everything as well with his disappearance and his loss, essentially. So I do want to go back to the beginning. I know that we've mentioned that Bob was an FBI agent, but I believe he started with the Drug Enforcement Agency, didn't he?
Correct. He had a very lengthy career in law enforcement. He loved the idea of being a federal agent. He, from a very young age, grew up wanting to be a federal agent. So his entree into that world was as a drug enforcement agent, a DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration agent. And then subsequently, when there was an opening, he moved over to the FBI. And I believe, if my memory serves, he spent about a combined 25 to 30 years as a federal government agent, first with the DEA and then with the FBI.
Okay. Was he primarily working on criminal cases, financial cases, counterintelligence kind of stuff? Like, what was
Oh,
his
yes,
specialty
thank you.
exactly?
He was a very hardcore criminal agent, and in fact, when he was here in the New York office of the FBI, he worked on organized crime cases. That
Hmm.
became his stock and trade. Then he kind of moved over into Russian organized crime cases because, as you may know, it was in the late 1980s and early 1990s, concurrent with the fall of the Soviet Union, that a lot of Russian gangsters moved to the United States, be it to parts of Brooklyn here in New York City, where I am, or Miami, and kind of set up shop there. And Bob was involved in some of the early investigations into Russian organized crime figures here in the US and kind of became known both as an expert on Russian organized crime and as someone who is adept at developing informants or people on the inside of crime families or criminal activities who subsequently, typically to save their own hide, would provide information to the FBI.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I know that would serve him very well later on. And it was during this time, I guess this is going way back to like the early to mid 90s. This is when he met Anne Jablonski, I believe, who would play a big part in his story later on.
That is
Is that
correct.
correct?
That's correct. So Anne Jablonski worked for a particular office within the analytical branch of the CIA. So, for the benefit of your listeners, the CIA is essentially divided up into two parts. There's the operational arm of the CIA, which is essentially the spying division, where people serve in the field, gathering information in foreign countries and feeding it back to CIA headquarters, where the analytical branch of the CIA kind of crunches that information, puts it into context, and writes up reports for policymakers and government officials to inform them about what's going on in the world, what kind of threats exist to the United States, who are the players in various countries, what kinds of activities are they involved with. Jablonski, who worked for a particular office in the analytical branch, also became an expert in Russian organized crime. She studied Russian when she was in college and was recruited by the CIA to work as an analyst. And she met Bob at law enforcement seminars, where prosecutors and federal agents and intelligence officials would get together to discuss topics. And in their case, it was the rise of Russian organized crime. They would share information as colleagues, and then eventually, after Bob retired from government and became a private investigator, they reconnected again when Anne was looking for people to work in her office, which was dealing in part with Russian organized crime, and particularly with money laundering and the use of banks and various financial institutions to move money around the world.
Okay, that makes sense, and it seems like they developed like a very, very strong professional relationship. But before I read the articles and then later on your book about this story, I did not expect that the CIA would be using private investigators for anything. I kind of thought that that's what they had the whole operations section for. So can you kind of explain how that worked exactly? Bob went out on his own. Was he out on his own specifically to work with Anne privately, or with her department privately, or did he have other like normal PI kind of cases as well?
Well, Justin, this is where things get sort of interesting and complicated because, for the benefit of your listeners, there are two sections to the CIA, the spying section and the operationals section. And they're supposed to steer clear of each other. In particular, the analytical section is not supposed to operate overseas. They're not supposed to send people overseas. They're just supposed to receive reports from the spies and analyze them, combine them with other information that they gather. So technically, Bob Levinson was sort of operating off the books, as you were, when although he did have a formal analytical contract with the CIA, he wasn't supposed to be going abroad, and there was a kind of wink, wink, nod, nod relationship with Anne Jablonski and himself, that he would be, picking up information for the CIA while he was abroad doing his work for private clients. So, if he went to visit a private client in, let's say, Dubai or in Eastern Europe or anywhere, he would be doing the work for the private client, and then he might repurpose that same work for the CIA or use the opportunity of being in an area to meet with someone or to gather information that was of interest to Anne Jablonski's unit. So, he was like juggling a couple of balls at the same time, but you know what was what became clear afterwards is that Anne, who was very ambitious and who wanted to kind of see her role at the CIA grow and believe that the spies really weren't doing their job well and weren't getting her the type of information that was needed to do her job well, was hoping that she and Bob would, be able to fill in where the professional spies were failing.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. This sounds like the kind of thing that would not have passed the smell test if anybody above Anne had really understood what was going on. Is that accurate?
One would like to think it was accurate. I had no information that there were people in the upper ranks of the CIA who were aware of that. In fact, when this all started to unravel, there were, secret hearings where top executives of the CIA were asked of this about this, and they were flabbergasted. They had no no idea that this was going on.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very very odd. I can see the appeal from Anne's perspective. Like she just has a guy she can email who can travel all over the world and ask questions, and she trusts him because she's known him for 20 years or something like that. But it does seem very very off the books and unofficial and all that.
Yes, and I had access to Bob's email correspondence, or at least much of it, between him and Anne, and it was very clear that the two of them were sort of, aware that certainly Anne was aware that they were running a game, and she was kind of enjoying it and enjoying that they were, they were getting stuff that people on the what she called the other side of the house weren't getting,
Hmm.
and how she essentially was showing them up.
Oh yeah, wow. So yeah, it sounds like some ego-driven decisions there, maybe. And by the way, I have to say, Barry, that that was really an amazing part of the book was the depth of access that you had to this email correspondence. Because I've read many many books over the past couple of years preparing for interviews like these and for my other work that I do, and nobody has the depth of access that I've seen like you have in that book. So it really, really lays out their professional relationship, goals, daily activities, all that. So that was really, really a big coup for you, in my opinion.
Well, that was largely something that I'm thankful and grateful to the Levinson family for, because shortly after I became aware of the story, and they were, this is in 2007, so this is now, 15 years ago. They were, desperately trying to figure out, well, what had happened to Bob, to their father, to a husband. I met with Bob's wife. She naturally was distraught,
Mm.
and I was aware from the family's lawyer that there were that she had large amounts of material that were was of interest to understanding Bob's situation, and she agreed to give me access to that information with the proviso that nothing I would do would jeopardize Bob's safety. And I felt, as a reporter, you don't necessarily start with that agreement, but I think it's an agreement that you would automatically want to have with someone who's providing you with the sensitivity of the type of information that I was getting. But that's a promise I made to her. I remember that to Chris Levinson very, at our first meeting, that, if she entrusted this material with me, I would not do anything that would jeopardize Bob's
Hmm.
safety. And that became sort of the overarching moral principle, whatever you want to call it, or, ethical principle that guided my reporting throughout. So, when David McGee, who was the family's lawyer, very nice guy in Florida, when his secretary was able to crack into Bob's emails, and I got all his email correspondence with Anne Jablonski, all of that information was covered by the same agreement that I had made, that sort of fell under this whole overarching agreement that I had made. And so when I went out reporting on this story, tracking down the people that Bob had met on his way to Kish, interviewing them, at no time did I ever disclose to any of those people that, I was aware of, one, his relationship with the CIA, or two, who he was working with. Although, during the course of the reporting, obviously, I also confronted Anne, got to know her, and spoke to her at length about their relationship.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really wonderful insight into everyone involved, honestly. So I'm very glad that you were able to kind of wait until the time was right, with all of this information, and then tell the story as fully as it could be told. Anyway, so Barry, since you mentioned that he might be going to Dubai or Eastern Europe, of course, it's clear that he's not just a PI working on divorce cases here in the U.S. or something. So I take it he had some very very big clients like corporations and that sort of thing that he was working for.
Right. I mean, he typically worked for lawyers who had cases that might have involved, money laundering, drug smuggling, issues related to Russian organized crime. In fact, David McGee, who himself was a Justice Department official, he was prosecutor a drug prosecutor in southern Florida, got to know Bob. He actually was, in northern Florida. He was eventually settles down in Pensacola, but he sort of covered the whole, cocaine cowboy era in Florida. He got to know Bob in connection with those cases, and then subsequently hired him when he became a private attorney to work on cases that he was investigating.
Hmm.
Similarly, Bob worked for a lot of law firms here in New York that were involved in cases involving, suspected Russian organized crime figures, things of that nature.
Hmm. Yeah, very serious stuff, but that's what he'd been doing his whole career. So it sounds like he was the right guy for it.
Yes, yes.
So let's go, Barry, to Kish Island then. So what was it that took him to this island and to this meeting that took place there where everything changed?
So one of Bob's closest friends was Ira Silverman. Ira Silverman was a sort of seminal figure in my business, which is journalism, because he became in the 1980s became the first kind of investigative producer of feature shows and investigations for a major television network. And so Ira was always looking around for, crime stories, and organized crime stories were, very much a hot area of interest for television news. And so in the course of his work as a journalism in journalism, Ira met Bob and they became close friends, and Bob became a source for Ira and would feed him, tips and stories. And a number of the shows that Ira did were based on information that he had gotten from Bob. Separately, Ira had other law enforcement sources, and in 1980 or thereabouts, there was a very high profile killing that took place in Washington, D.C. To set the scene, the Iranian Revolution had taken place, the Shah of Iran had been deposed, and some of his former allies and subordinates had come to the United States. And there was a young Black American by the name who took on the name Daoud Salahuddin, who was sort of a follower of the Islamic Revolution, and they targeted former aides of the Shah for elimination. And Daoud assassinated a former aide to the Shah of Iran at his home outside Washington, D.C., in a very, in a kind of scene that sort of became, that was almost cinematic. It became almost based on that film, The 3 Days of the Condor, where he came to this fellow's house disguised as a postman carrying a package, and inside the package he had a pistol, and when this individual opened the door, he shot and killed him. He flees then, successfully evades the police, flees to Iran, and is there. And Ira gets to know him, goes to meet him in Iran, does a story about him, and then years later they still stay in contact, and he gets the sense from Dawood that he maybe wants to come back to the United States or become a source for the United States government as a way of getting leniency and, coming to some rapprochement that will allow him to return.
Every day, you're under attack, whether you realize it or not. Your digital devices contain your entire life, your finances, your conversations with friends and family, your interests, and even your movements. And all of that is vulnerable to an ever expanding class of criminals, scam artists, hackers, and even governments. You don't want to leave your data security entirely in the hands of your ISP, or anyone else for that matter. It's up to you to protect yourself using a multi-layered defense strategy. Silent offers you the protection you need to keep your data and devices secure from wireless threats. Their multi-shield technology blocks cellular signals, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, EMP, RFID, NFC, and more. Silent's lineup includes everything from signal blocking wallets all the way up to 40 cubic liter Faraday duffel bags. When you're geared up with Silent, you'll be truly disconnected, undetectable, untraceable, and unhackable. And you can now use the discount code Spycraft101 to save 10% off your order from Silent. Find them at slnt.com. That's slnt.com. Okay, so he's got, well, what does he have to offer in exchange for this potential, return to the United States? Because if he fled after murdering somebody, a political assassination, really, then that's a very, very hard thing to overcome if you want to come back to the United States after so many years away.
Well, I mean, he claimed that he, had inside information on, Iranian government's nuclear development
Mm.
program, the type of, extremely sensitive information that the United States government could not get elsewhere because, as you might imagine, the United States government does not have spies in Iran, or if it does, they don't live for very long. So Iran is one of those countries that really has not been very deeply penetrated by the US. And Dawood was claiming, and we have no idea whether there was any truth to it, although one might suspect there wasn't, that he could supply the US with with intelligence information that it could not otherwise get. And I think what we should, bear in mind is that, the United States government often is led to believe that people often makes deals with people to become informants with the blind, in blind faith, or hoping that they're going to pan out when in fact these informants are just playing them. I mean, I guess the case of Whitey Bulger, the famed
Mm.
mafia figure in Boston who became a supposed FBI informant, really was doing so to protect himself. And I think with the CIA, you have very similar situations.
Okay, I see. So how does this work then exactly? So Ira mentions it to Bob, and Bob mentions that it's something he might be able to do to Anne, and Anne says that's a great idea, or something like that.
Well, the first part of that is correct. Ira mentions it to Bob. Bob believes, you know what? I am very eager to, don't forget, he's just at this point, he's working as a part time consultant to the CIA. His contract is about to expire. He wants to keep things going, and he would like, I think, in the in the most ideal world, to enlarge his relationship with the CIA, to make it, a bigger source of work, a bigger source of income. He was very proud of his relationship with the US government, and he wanted that to continue. He does not, to the best of our knowledge, mention this specifically to Anne.
Hmm.
He hints around at it, that I can get information. I'm going to be going to Dubai and I might be making a side trip, and I think I can get some information about this, but he never directly states to her that, guess what? I'm going to be going to Kish Island to meet with this escaped American fugitive who claims to have information about the Iranian government. And so, that is where the story gets even, more curious, because it seems that Bob decided, I'm going to go and do this. And maybe then once I get a feeling for, the type of information that Daoud can supply us, maybe that's when I'll tell Anne about it, and we'll sort of go from there. Because bear in mind, this was, he disappears on his first trip there. It's not like he was taking several trips
Okay.
there, and then on the third or fourth one is when he disappears. This is the first time that he goes there,
Hmm.
and one might suspect that they knew, that is, the Iranian intelligence services may have known he was coming, either because they were interrupting, monitoring his correspondence or Ira Silverman's correspondence with Daoud, or because Daoud was a double agent who, for his own purposes, ratted Bob out and set him up.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so since
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier that Bob would help out when he was on assignment for his regular commercial clients, did he have some other reason to be on Kish Island, or was this specifically a trip to meet with no one?
That was no that was specifically, a trip to meet with
Oh man.
Daoud,
Okay.
to set, to give himself cover, a reason for being there in case he was stopped by the Iranian authorities. He came up with a plan, and this plan was this. One of the areas that he generated a lot of work in was the area of cigarette smuggling, which was basically, if Philip Morris or another major cigarette manufacturer, discovers that there are, criminals who are in business making counterfeit versions of their cigarettes and selling them, right? They look like Marlboros, they're in a box that looks like a Marlboro box, but it's actually being made by, some gang in Eastern Europe
Hmm.
that's selling them on the black market. And so one of his accounts, Bob's accounts, was working for a firm in London that did investigations into counterfeit cigarette manufacturing for British American Tobacco, which is the largest British cigarette producer. And they had actually an official agreement with the government of Iran to sell their products in Iran, but there's a huge number of counterfeit products that are also sold in Iran. And Kish Island is sort of a nexus for counterfeiting, because you can take these little, these boats from places like Dubai, and shuttle contraband from offshore through Kish Island into Iran. And so Bob basically created a counterfeit letter saying that, that he was there on behalf of British American Tobacco to investigate cigarette smuggling in Iran. So he used his professional role, his to kind of serve for what he hoped would be a cover story in case he was ever stopped by the Iranian authorities.
My gosh. So, I mean, of course, we already know at least somewhat how this story ends, and it ends very badly for Bob. But was this the kind of thing that he would normally do, like fake his way into places, talk his way into places that he really shouldn't be? Because, I can't imagine
Well,
an
I
American
think,
FBI agent going to
I
Iran.
think he was very, very good. Bob was very good at, I don't want to say faking, but he was very good at posing. And he would, that was part of his skill set in developing informants, to sort of create an image of himself that, would be, a sympathetic character, someone who was interested in your plight, as someone who, maybe was a low man on the totem pole of a gang, or felt that they had been mistreated. by the leader of a gang. And so he took advantage. That was a real skill of his. I don't think that, his stock in trade was creating false documents, but in this case it was sort of, he believed it was necessary to for his own safety, because why would would the Iranians believe that he was there, like, as a tourist? Like, what was a big former FBI agent with a Jewish last name doing in Iran if he wasn't there for professional purposes? In fact, when I first learned of the story, I thought he was there for to investigate cigarette smuggling, because that's the way it was originally portrayed in news reports about his disappearance. And since I had covered the tobacco industry for the New York Times back in the 1990s, when all of this litigation was going on between the states and the tobacco companies, I called up people I knew in the industry who were familiar with cigarette smuggling, or who worked with investigators investigating cigarette smuggling, told them about this story, and they, to a person, they were all stunned, because they said there was no way that they would ever send someone into Iran to investigate cigarette smuggling who was not, like, who didn't speak Farsi, the language
Hmm.
of Iran, who didn't look like a local, who would stick out the minute that they stepped off an airplane.
Man. So, do we know exactly what happened once he arrived in Kish? What transpired there? Because we don't really. The trail kind of goes cold a little bit to a certain extent, doesn't it?
Yes, what we do know is very limited amount of information, which is, one, that he meets Daoud at a hotel. And then that day, that evening, the police arrive at that hotel. Daoud claims that he's the one that was taken away, and that when, for questioning, and that when he returns to the hotel, Bob's he was told that Bob had already left for the airport to go back to Dubai, because Bob was just supposed to be there overnight. In fact, what seems far more likely is that Daoud was lying, and that it was Bob who was the one who was taken away. And at that point, we really don't know what happened to him, other than it's pretty clear that he was kept in the what would be the Iranian equivalent of a CIA black prison, that he was arrested, accused of spying, but not kept in the general prison
Hmm.
population, but in a separate facility, a separate cell or location, so that his identity would not become known to other prisoners.
Hmm. Okay, I see. And how quickly did anyone realize that something had gone wrong? Was it within hours, days, weeks?
They realized that something was wrong when he was supposed to show up in London. No one knew he had gone to Iran. His
Right,
family
right.
didn't know that. His work colleagues didn't know that. Someone was supposed to meet him in London. In fact, a guy who worked for the investigative firm there that did investigations for British American Tobacco was supposed to meet him at the airport in London. When he went out to the airport, the flight arrives. Bob is not on it. After a couple of days, the alarm starts getting sounded. And that's when Ira Silverman, the television producer, tells he was aware that Bob had gone to Iran, that he had gone there to meet Daoud Salahuddin. That's when he tells Bob's wife, what he knows or what he believes has happened.
Hmm. How did the family take it? Were they in any way used to him kind of disappearing like this, or were they also immediately?
Oh,
concern.
absolutely. Absolutely not. I mean, you know, bear in mind that at this point in time, his children are of different ages. Some of them are extremely young, right? He has children that are spread out. There's maybe, I used to know this by heart, I've since forgotten, but there was maybe close to a 20-year or 15-year gap between his oldest child and the youngest of the seven children. And so, some of them really are quite young when he disappears. They're maybe 10 or 12 years old. The older ones are in their late 20s. And, so this is a very, like for Chris, the wife, this is a terribly wrenching situation. Both how is she going to deal with it? And how is she going to deal with it where her children are concerned? What is she going to say to them? And how are they going to respond to it? So it was a very, very difficult ordeal. And it became an increasingly difficult ordeal when, some of the children learned and understood the sort of gravity of the situation. And Dan Levinson, who was one of Bob's sons, you know, many years later, like went first with his mother to Kish Island looking for clues that might help them understand where Bob was and what had happened to him.
Yeah, that was just so brave of them to go and take that trip like that, knowing that there could and probably was very very serious danger there. Were they able to find out anything of substance once they finally made it to Kish Island?
Nothing,
Hmm.
nothing. I mean, I think the purpose of their trip was to try to focus the, like in any hostage situation, to focus attention on the plight of the person who's disappeared and may be held hostage, and try to motivate, you know, the States government as much as the Iranian government to do something about it. And the one of the tragedies for me, and I certainly for me, in following this story, was how docile the United States was in trying to find Bob and bring him home.
Yeah, this is such a strange position for everyone to be in. It's really such a strange diplomatic situation, I guess. And of course, relations with Iran have been very, very difficult for many years when they existed at all. No question about that. So, what was the official U.S. government response to all this? Because I know that relations with Iran have been incredibly tense when they existed at all. So, did they provide any answers or go to any effort for him or his family at all?
Well, at a certain point, they did. They, for many years, they didn't. It was like there was a schism between the CIA, which was denying that they knew anything about him, and sort of like stonewalling the FBI's efforts to figure out what happened. And then at a certain point in time, after the video emerged, which I now realize was probably in 2011 or so, they tried to set up. They did have a series of meetings with Iranian officials to discuss, try to gently figure out what they knew about Bob and was there any way they could arrange for his release. But basically, the Iranians who were there, were kind of just playing a game with them and doing nothing to be
Hmm.
helpful. I mean, there has been a long-standing theory that Bob was kidnapped in retaliation for the disappearance of, or and believed defection of, a senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard general and spy to the West,
Hmm.
and that the CIA had been complicit in his defection, and Bob was essentially being held as a chip to figure out what had happened to this general and potentially, trade Bob to get him
Hmm.
back.
My gosh. So what about within the CIA with Anne and her coworkers and everything? What happened with them?
Well, once the government there were some people in the Senate who became aware of what had happened, and they essentially, asked senior executives of the CIA about it, who said, "This is news to us. We know nothing about this." They started an internal CIA investigation, and Anne and several members of this unit that she worked for were essentially forced out of the CIA.
Hmm. That's imagine very harsh punishment, I would guess, for them to have to clean house like that, because that's probably not something
Right.
that the Senate would believe. You're the CIA and you don't know what's going on within your own section. That's got to be a extremely embarrassing situation for them.
It certainly was for the higher ups. It certainly was very unusual, even within the CIA, for people to get drummed out of the CIA in that fashion. And don't forget, when this is happening, no one knows why it's happening because the CIA is still keeping this whole episode secret.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is all happening under a veil of secrecy. And I have no idea what people were telling their friends and neighbors about why they suddenly had a new
Mm.
job.
Yeah. That's a tough. Yeah, tough. That's a tough thing to talk about, no doubt about it. So, where did all of this end up? Because I know that Bob never came home. Is it still an open question as to what happened to him? Is there any closure for his family or anything at all?
Sadly, that question appears to have been closed. I mean, the last evidence that he was alive was in, I believe, 2011 when this videotape appeared. And that was, that the FBI was able to technically confirm that it was shot at that period of time. It wasn't like something had been shot in 2007 and then repurposed and
Mm, right.
released in 2011. I believe it was last year or a year and a half ago, the Levenson family, which had been lobbying for many, many years to, try to get the government to, interact with Iran, to bring some resolution to Bob's case, to bring Bob back. And don't forget, several years ago, there were a number of individuals, including Jason Rezaian, the reporter with the Washington Post, who had been held in Iran on spying charges. They were released, and the Levinson family was under the impression that Bob would be released
Hmm.
at the same time that they were, and naturally they were devastated when that didn't take place. So the Levinson family was brought down to the State Department, I believe, or some agency at the government, and were told at that time that the government had received information that led it to conclude that Bob had passed away while in captivity.
My gosh. So the family, I assume that they don't have any hope of getting back his remains at the very least, or anything like that, as far as you know.
Well, I think they probably do hold out that hope, but I also think that I don't want to speak for them, but I imagine that they believe that or feel that is unlikely given the nature of this whole story.
Yeah, it's been nothing but disappointments for them since he first went to Kish Island, I guess. So it's hard to imagine them how difficult it must be to hold on to
Yeah.
hope even now.
Yes, and I think, there probably does come a point in time where as much as one wants there to be a humane resolution of this story, and at this point, that humane resolution would simply be to return his body, to return his personal effects, to return something that would give the family closure. This is sadly the type of story where we don't see that kind of humanity, and that's very, 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 very sad. Sort of heartbreaking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, my heart really goes out for that family for all that they've been through, and it doesn't seem like it's completely over with and may never be over with for them. Certainly. It's hard to imagine trying to move on from something like that with so many unanswered questions.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow. Well, this has been very, very interesting, Barry. I really appreciate your time. And for everyone who wants to read, we've only covered a fraction of Bob's story, honestly. And so I highly encourage you to pick up Barry's book. It's called Missing Man, published in 2016. Very, very informative about Bob's story and a lot of other related stories as well about Iran and Russian organized crime and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in those topics, make sure to pick up the book and you will certainly learn a lot. Barry, can I ask what you're working on right now? Any other big projects in the works? A new book, maybe?
I don't have a new book in the works, but I'm sort of excited at the moment because you had mentioned my first book, Painkiller, and on August 10th, Netflix is going to release a 6-part dramatic series based on the book that stars Matthew Broderick and Uzo Abuda. I've seen it and it's very exciting. And a new version, a kind of an updated version of Painkiller, is being released at the end of July in conjunction with that Netflix
Wow.
series.
Okay, that's fantastic. I didn't know that. Is it also going to be called Painkiller?
Yes, yes, the series is called
Great,
Painkiller.
great. I'll definitely have to look for that. I love Matthew Broderick as well. So yeah, I'm very excited about that. That sounds terrific.
He's very good in it. He's very good in
Good,
it.
good, good. So
He's
Barry,
he's very bad. He's very bad, but he's very good. So,
good. Yeah, I'd like
one
to
of
see
those
him in a bad
situations.
role. Honestly, I haven't seen that from him before, but it sounds interesting. So,
Yeah.
do you have like online social media presence or public profile or anything if people want to follow you and kind of connect with you after they hear this episode?
Yeah, I have a Twitter feed that's Barry Meier and a website, Barry Meier Books. So if people want to send me questions, maybe the best way to do it is through barrymeyerbooks.com.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Barry. This has been very informative. I really
All right.
appreciate it.
Terrific. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.